The oak beams of the Clearwater Valley Archive creak under the weight of forgotten stories. Among its weathered ledgers and faded correspondence lies the curious tale of Thomas Guthrie's Crooked Cabin, once the laughingstock of Harlan County, Kentucky, later a testament to frontier wisdom that would challenge conventional building practices across the Cumberland Gap settlements of the 1870s. What began as ridicule for an eccentric settler's peculiar construction methods would eventually force an entire community to reconsider what it meant to be prepared in America's unforgiving Appalachian frontier. The story of Guthrie's cabin stands as a quiet monument to foresight, practical ingenuity, and the often harsh lessons that shaped America's rural communities. Tucked within the dusty archive records of Harlan County sits a surveyor's assessment from April 1874, written in the precise hand of County Assessor Jeremiah Willard. The document contains a curious notation beside the property listing for newcomer Thomas Guthrie. Dwelling unconventional in design, appears deliberately constructed at odd angles. Value assessed below standard for size due to questionable structural integrity. This understated bureaucratic observation marks the beginning of a sequence of events that would test the very fabric of frontier community ethics and leave behind lessons that would echo through generations of mountain builders. The story begins in the spring of 1873, when Thomas Guthrie, a 42-year-old former shipwright from coastal Maine, arrived in the Cumberland Gap region of southeastern Kentucky. He purchased 60 acres of steeply sloped woodland in what was then the sparsely populated northern section of Harlan County. In the county deed book, the transaction is recorded for the sum of $78 paid to the previous owner, a cattle driver who had held the difficult terrain for speculation but never settled it. Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. While most settlers to the region sought flat bottomland near creek beds for easier building and farming, Guthrie deliberately selected this challenging hillside property that others had passed over. His first action, according to the testimonial of neighboring farmer Isaiah Berkeley, recorded in 1879, was not to clear a standard home site, but to spend nearly 3 weeks observing the land. Most peculiar behavior, Berkeley noted in correspondence to his brother in Virginia. The man makes detailed markings of wind patterns and water flows before cutting a single tree, sleeps under a simple canvas while studying the hillside as if it might speak to him. The Cumberland Gap region, straddling the borders of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, had been settled in waves since the late 1700s, with most inhabitants following traditional building methods passed down through generations of Appalachian settlers. These techniques had evolved to address the general conditions of the region, but were largely standardized, regardless of specific local variations in terrain or weather patterns. The prevailing wisdom emphasized efficiency and uniformity over site-specific adaptation. Against this backdrop of established practice, Guthrie's methodical observation of his particular property stood out as strange, even suspicious. The Harlan County Historical Society preserves a letter from nearby resident Thomas Moore to his cousin in North Carolina, dated June 1873, which observes, "Our newest arrival spends more time watching the wind move through trees than clearing his land. Some wonder if he might be touched in the head, though he speaks sensibly enough when engaged in conversation at the general store." What followed was even more curious to the established settlers. Rather than employing the standard rectangular cabin design with squared corners and traditional joinery typical throughout Appalachia, Guthrie began constructing what locals soon derided as a crooked house. The foundation stones were laid in an irregular pattern that seemed to follow the natural contours of the hillside. The main support beams were set at what appeared to be arbitrary angles, rather than the traditional right angles used in frontier construction. County records from the Harlan General Store show Guthrie purchased unusual quantities of iron hardware, far more than typically used in cabin construction of the era. The receipt, dated June 18, 1873, lists 37 LEBs, assorted iron braces, 24 heavy bolts with nuts, 18 iron straps. Such quantities would be expected for a barn or public building, not a single-family dwelling. The store proprietor, Abner Holbrook, would later recall in testimony to the County Historical Society in 1886, "I inquired as to the purpose of such extensive metalwork in a simple cabin." Mr. Guthrie explained that where he came from, structures had to withstand forces coming from multiple directions, not just the downward pressure of gravity. I took this to reference his shipbuilding background, though at the time I considered it an unnecessary complication for mountain dwelling. This reference to multiple directional forces reveals an important aspect of Guthrie's approach that distinguished it from local building traditions. Conventional Appalachian cabins were designed primarily to support vertical loads, the weight of the roof, particularly when laden with snow, while giving less consideration to lateral stresses such as wind pressure. Guthrie, drawing on his shipbuilding experience, approached structural integrity from a fundamentally different perspective. By late summer of 1873, the structure taking shape on Guthrie's hillside property had become something of a local curiosity. The main cabin, approximately 26 feet by 32 feet according to tax records, featured walls that appeared to lean and bend in response to the hillside's topography. The roof, instead of following the standard pitch seen throughout the region, had an asymmetrical design with one side extending much lower than the other, creating what one visitor called the appearance of a vessel listing heavily to port. The peculiarities extended to the interior as well. Martha Collins, whose husband delivered supplies to the remote property, noted in her household diary that the floor plan defied convention. Rooms connect in circular fashion rather than the practical square arrangement any sensible builder would employ. Windows placed seemingly without pattern. Hearth sits oddly off-center. Most notably, a second, smaller structure was built approximately 15 feet from the main cabin, connected by what Collins described as an enclosed walkway with walls as sturdy as the cabin itself. This unusual design did not escape the attention or judgment of the community. The Cumberland Weekly Gazette from September 1873 contained a brief item mentioning a most curious dwelling being erected by the newcomer Guthrie, suggesting either incompetence in basic carpentry or ideas too foreign for practical mountain living. The paper further noted that neighbors express concern that such unsuitable construction will not withstand the first winter storms. What the newspaper account failed to capture was the deliberate nature of Guthrie's design choices. Archaeological excavations conducted at the site in 1963 by the University of Kentucky revealed that the foundation stones were arranged to create a structure that would flex slightly rather than rigidly oppose strong winds, a principle well understood in shipbuilding but rarely applied to static structures in the region. The asymmetrical roof, far from being a haphazard construction, was specifically angled to minimize snow accumulation and channel wind flows in a way that reduced direct pressure on the walls. William Harkins, proprietor of the hardware store in nearby Pineville, recorded in his business ledger a note beside Guthrie's name. Advised customer regarding proper building methods for region. Suggestions politely declined. Customer insists on purchasing excessive iron fittings and non-standard lumber cuts. The iron fittings that seemed excessive to Harkins were, in fact, carefully selected reinforcements for key stress points in the structure. Ship construction in the mid-19th century had developed sophisticated methods for distributing force throughout a wooden frame using strategically placed metal braces, knowledge Guthrie apparently adapted to his cabin design. The non-standard lumber cuts similarly reflected maritime carpentry techniques that prioritized strength and flexibility over the simpler joinery methods common in frontier construction. Throughout the fall of 1873, as other settlers rushed to complete their harvest and winter preparations, Guthrie was observed spending inordinate time on seemingly excessive reinforcements to his already unorthodox structure. Delivery records from the sawmill in Pineville show multiple orders for additional lumber, with specific requests for curved oak pieces and birch planks of unusual width, materials rarely used in standard cabin construction. A receipt dated October 12, 1873, preserved in the county archives, shows Guthrie purchased 12 yards of heavy canvas, 8 pounds of pitch, and 4 pounds of beeswax, items typically associated with waterproofing in maritime applications rather than home building. Later examination of surviving portions of the structure would reveal that he used these materials to create sealed joints in critical areas, providing protection against wind-driven rain and snow that far exceeded normal cabin weatherproofing. The local reaction to Guthrie's methods ranged from amusement to outright mockery. The term Guthrie's folly began appearing in correspondence and local conversation. Jeremiah Willard, the county assessor, later testified that during his official visit, several men from neighboring properties had gathered to point out the cabin's perceived flaws, making predictions about which section would collapse first when real Kentucky weather arrived. Particularly noteworthy was the community's response to Guthrie's installation of diagonal bracing within the walls, a technique now standard in modern construction, but unusual in that era's Appalachian building traditions. Isaiah Berkeley's journal records a gathering at the general store where local builder Samuel Thompson declared the approach a waste of good lumber that should be straightened properly or discarded, not forced into unnatural positions. This comment reveals how fundamentally Guthrie's methods challenged not just practical building techniques, but deeper assumptions about what constituted proper and natural approaches to working with materials. His willingness to deliberately introduce angles and curves that appeared irregular to the conventional eye represented a different philosophical approach to construction that prioritized functional adaptation over visual regularity. Guthrie himself remained largely detached from community affairs, declining invitations to barn raisings and harvest gatherings that formed the social backbone of frontier life. His only regular contact came through monthly supply purchases and occasional attendance at the Clearwater Valley Meeting House, where, according to church attendance records, he sat quietly in the back row and departed promptly after services. This social isolation likely contributed to the community's skepticism about his building methods. In frontier societies where shared labor and mutual aid were essential survival strategies, Guthrie's self-sufficient approach to construction, working alone rather than enlisting neighbors' help as was customary, marked him as an outsider beyond just his unusual techniques. What little is known of Guthrie's background comes from fragmented records. Ship registries from Portland, Maine confirm his prior occupation as a shipwright employed by the Eastland Shipping Company from 1852 to 1871. His departure coincides with a notation in company records citing irreconcilable disagreements regarding vessel design modifications proposed by T. Guthrie. A single surviving letter preserved in the county archives addressed to "My dear brother Thomas" from someone named Eleanor in Maine makes reference to his stubborn insistence on building methods too unconventional for the old guard to accept. These scattered pieces suggest a man whose unconventional ideas had already created friction in his previous life, perhaps explaining both his move to the remote Kentucky frontier and his apparent indifference to local opinions about his building practices. Maritime records from Portland provide additional context for understanding Guthrie's approach. The 1860s saw significant innovations in shipbuilding techniques, as wooden vessels were constructed to ever larger specifications, requiring new solutions to structural challenges. One such article from 1867, which may have influenced Guthrie's thinking, argued that the principles of naval architecture must evolve beyond simple scaling of established designs toward fundamental reconsideration of how forces are distributed throughout the vessel's frame. This perspective, that larger challenges require not just more of the same solutions but different approaches entirely, seems to align with Guthrie's willingness to depart from conventional building wisdom when confronting the harsh conditions of Appalachian winters. Several technical articles in the Portland Maritime Register from that period discuss the inadequacy of traditional shipbuilding methods for these larger vessels, particularly regarding lateral stability in heavy seas. By December of 1873, Guthrie's cabin was substantially complete, though locals noted ongoing modifications continued even as the first winter weather arrived. The property now featured not only the main crooked cabin and the connected outbuilding, but also an unusually deep well house, a root cellar dug far larger than seemed necessary for a single man, and a woodshed stacked with what the postmaster described as enough timber to heat 3 normal cabins through 2 winters. The excessive storage capacity, like many aspects of Guthrie's preparations, prompted community commentary. Martha Collins's diary entry from December 15th notes, "Past the Guthrie property today. His stockpiling suggests expectation of siege rather than winter. Jacob says the man has provisions enough to last until second planting, though what one person would do with such quantities defies explanation." This assessment reflects the community's standard approach to winter preparation, which typically involved storing enough provisions to last until the first spring thaw allowed resupply from neighboring settlements. Guthrie's more extensive preparations implied either excessive caution or a fundamental misunderstanding of local winter conditions, or so it seemed to his neighbors at the time. The early winter of 1873-74 proved mild by regional standards, leading to increased confidence among local settlers that Guthrie's excessive preparations were unnecessary and his unconventional design merely the product of an eccentric mind. Isaiah Berkeley's journal entry from January 1874 noted, "Our newcomer's crooked house still stands, though no thanks to its design. The gentle winter has spared him the harsh lesson his folly deserves." This judgment reflects a common human tendency to confuse fortune with validation, interpreting the absence of disaster as confirmation that preparations against such disasters were unnecessary rather than simply untested. The mild winter reinforced the community's confidence in traditional building methods and further marginalized Guthrie's unconventional approach. Weather records from Louisville for the winter of 1873-74 confirmed that temperatures remained relatively moderate throughout the season, with only 2 brief cold snaps in January that brought temperatures below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Snowfall was similarly modest, with no single storm depositing more than 4 inches. These conditions presented no significant challenge to either traditional or innovative building techniques. As the winter progressed without incident, the novelty of Guthrie's strange dwelling faded from local conversation. The spring planting season of 1874 brought the usual increase in community activity, with attention turning to more pressing matters of crops and livestock. Guthrie himself established a small workshop adjacent to his cabin and began producing wooden tools and implements that he occasionally traded at the general store. This shift in occupation from building to craftsmanship provides an important insight into Guthrie's character. Having completed his dwelling to his satisfaction, he turned his skilled hands to creating objects of practical value for daily use. This practicality, focused on function over form, would prove to be a consistent theme in his approach to frontier life. Entries in the store's ledger indicate that while his carpentry skills earned some grudging respect, his peculiar cabin remained an occasional subject of derision. Store owner Abner Holbrook's personal notes mention, "Guthrie brings finely crafted axe handles and mallets for trade." Ironic that a man who builds such a misshapen dwelling can produce tools of such precision. This observation reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of Guthrie's approach. The apparent contradiction between his precise tool-making and misshapen dwelling failed to recognize that both reflected the same underlying philosophy, form dictated by function rather than convention. His tools were precisely crafted because their purpose required precision. His cabin was irregularly shaped because its purpose, withstanding extreme weather on a particular hillside, required adaptation to site-specific conditions. The rhythms of frontier life continued through the summer and fall of 1874. Harvests were brought in, preserves were put up, and the usual preparations for winter commenced. Weather patterns had been typically variable, with periodic storms and dry spells marking the seasons in their usual progression. Nothing suggested the approaching winter would differ significantly from those that had come before. However, entries in multiple journals and official records begin to note unusual meteorological observations by late November 1874. Martha Collins's diary from November 28th mentions an unsettling stillness in the air, and birds departing much earlier than memory serves from previous years. The Pineville Mill Ledger contains a margin note about peculiar ice formations appearing upriver before normal freeze period. These subtle environmental signals, largely dismissed at the time, foreshadowed significant atmospheric changes. Modern meteorological analysis suggests they likely indicated the formation of a particularly strong polar vortex pattern that would eventually channel Arctic air much further south than usual. Most telling is a terse note in the Cumberland Weekly Gazette dated December 2, 1874. Unusual barometric readings reported by Louisville Weather Service. Residents advised to complete winter preparations with all haste. This official warning, while notable enough to merit newspaper mention, does not appear to have prompted extraordinary measures beyond normal winter preparations in most households. The community's experience with generally predictable winter patterns had created a sense of routine preparedness that would soon prove inadequate. These scattered observations would soon prove to be harbingers of what local histories would later call the Great Cumberland Storm of '74, a weather event unprecedented in both its intensity and duration, which would forever alter how the community viewed Thomas Guthrie and his crooked cabin. The first signs of the approaching weather system appeared on December 5, 1874, when an early snowfall blanketed the region with approximately 6 inches of snow, not exceptional by itself, but unusual for so early in the season. This was followed by 3 days of deep, unusual calm. Multiple diaries note the eerie quiet that settled over the valleys, with one writer comparing it to the breath being held before words that will change everything. This meteorological phenomenon, a period of unusual stillness preceding a major storm system, is now recognized as the result of high-pressure air masses giving way to approaching low-pressure systems. In the Cumberland region, such calm periods typically preceded standard winter storms, but the depth and duration of this particular calm suggested something more significant to those attuned to natural patterns. Thomas Guthrie appears to have been among those who recognized the warning signs. The general store ledger shows he made a final large purchase on December 7th, acquiring additional lamp oil, matches, salt, and flour. More significantly, a note from Abner Holbrook mentions that Guthrie inquired whether any neighbors in the northern valley might need assistance with preparations, offering to share his surplus if needed. This offer, apparently rebuffed, represents the first documented instance of Guthrie reaching out to the broader community, perhaps indicating his growing concern about the approaching weather. On December 9th, the storm proper began with winds that quickly escalated from strong to ferocious. The Cumberland Weekly Gazette's December 16th issue, delayed due to the storm, described gale forces that bent mature oaks and lifted the tin roof clean off the Pineville schoolhouse. The county clerk's damage report, filed after the event, cataloged no fewer than 17 standard-built cabins that suffered partial or complete roof loss during the first night of the storm. Modern meteorological reconstructions estimate that wind speeds likely reached 60-70 miles per hour in exposed areas, far exceeding the normal winter gales the region typically experienced. These winds came predominantly from the northwest, channeled and intensified by the topography of the Cumberland Gap, creating particularly severe conditions in valleys oriented along that axis. The wind was followed by freezing rain that coated everything in layers of ice, adding destructive weight to structures already battered by wind. Temperature records from the Louisville Weather Service, later reprinted in the Cumberland Gazette, showed a precipitous drop from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 3 degrees below zero within a 14-hour period. This rapid temperature drop created conditions particularly dangerous for both structures and living beings. Materials contracted rapidly, causing joints to separate in buildings. Bodies lost heat faster than they could generate it, leading to hypothermia cases even among those who found shelter from wind and precipitation. What made this storm particularly devastating, however, was not just its intensity, but its duration. Weather records confirmed that instead of passing through in the usual 2 to 3 days, the system stalled over the Cumberland region for nearly 2 weeks, bringing alternating cycles of heavy snow, freezing rain, and plummeting temperatures that prevented any thaw or relief. The meteorological cause of this unusual persistence can be traced to a blocking high-pressure system over the eastern Atlantic that prevented the normal west to east progression of weather systems across the continent. Similar patterns have been observed in other historic winter weather events, such as the Great Blizzard of 1888, though with different regional impacts. By the third day, community resources were already strained to breaking. The Harlan County Emergency Relief Ledger, a handwritten record kept by the county commissioner, documents the rapid deterioration of conditions. December 11th, 6 families from outlying properties arrive at Town Hall seeking shelter after roof collapses. Supplies sufficient for 3 days at current numbers. This entry reflects the standard emergency response procedure for the community: centralized shelter in the most substantial building available. What it fails to capture is how quickly this approach would prove inadequate as the storm continued beyond all expected time frames. The isolation of many homesteads quickly became a life-threatening reality. Roads and paths that connected the scattered settlement were rendered impassable by snowdrifts reaching heights of 6 to 7 feet in some areas. Jeremiah Willard's official report notes, communication between properties entirely cut off by 4th day of storm. Riders unable to make progress through drifts. No news from northern county settlements for 8 days. This extended isolation exceeded the preparations of most households. Standard practice in the region was to maintain enough supplies for 2 to 3 weeks of normal winter conditions. As the storm approached its second week with undiminished intensity, even well-prepared families found their resources critically depleted. The consequences grew increasingly dire as the storm continued unabated. The death toll, while not precisely recorded, can be partially reconstructed from church burial records in the spring of 1875, which show a marked increase in funerals compared to previous years. Most affected were the elderly and those in remote locations without adequate shelter or supplies. Particularly tragic was the situation at the Corbin farmstead, approximately 5 miles east of the town center. According to a letter written by surviving family member Carolyn Corbin in March 1875, the roof beams cracked like gunshots on the 4th night. We huddled in the root cellar as the dwelling above us was torn apart by the wind. 8 days we remained in that cramped space, rationing the few preserves stored there before help could reach us. The Corbin family's experience was replicated across the region with varying outcomes depending on the soundness of structures and adequacy of preparations. The standard building techniques that had served adequately during normal winters proved catastrophically inadequate against the sustained assault of the great storm. Against this backdrop of community crisis, the narrative of Thomas Guthrie and his crooked cabin takes a significant turn. According to multiple accounts collected after the event, Guthrie's unconventional dwelling not only withstood the storm intact, but became an unexpected haven of survival. Isaiah Berkeley, whose own well-built rectangular cabin lost half its roof on the second day of the storm, provided the most detailed account of what occurred at Guthrie's property. In a sworn statement to the county clerk dated January 20th, 1875, he described seeking shelter at his nearest neighbor's home after his own became uninhabitable. With no recourse and the temperature falling beyond endurance, my wife and I wrapped ourselves as thoroughly as possible and attempted to reach the Guthrie property, being the closest dwelling approximately 1 mile northwest of our own. The journey nearly claimed our lives as the wind seemed to cut through any protection our garments offered. Upon arrival, we were astounded to find the crooked structure not merely intact, but showing virtually no damage whatsoever. More surprising still, we discovered 3 other neighboring families already sheltered within. This account confirms that by the worst stages of the storm, Guthrie's once ridiculed cabin had become a critical survival point for multiple households. The specific phrasing that they were astounded to find the structure intact underscores how completely the community had expected Guthrie's unconventional design to fail. Berkeley's account goes on to describe how the unusual design features of Guthrie's cabin, previously objects of derision, proved to be purposeful adaptations to extreme weather conditions. The asymmetrical roof, far from being a construction flaw, effectively channeled the powerful winds up and over the structure rather than allowing them to catch the broader side of a traditional roof. The walls, built at their odd angles and heavily reinforced with the iron braces Guthrie had purchased in such quantities, dispersed the wind pressure rather than receiving its full force as a flat surface would. What appeared most remarkable, Berkeley continued, was observing how the entire structure seemed to yield slightly with the strongest gusts, bending rather than breaking as our own square-built homes had done. The diagonal braces within the walls, which we had considered wasteful and peculiar, prevented the frame from distorting beyond recovery, even as it flexed with each blast. This observation highlights a fundamental difference in engineering philosophy between Guthrie's approach and traditional methods. Conventional frontier construction emphasized rigidity, attempting to resist environmental forces through sheer strength. Guthrie's shipbuilding background had taught him that absolute rigidity often leads to catastrophic failure in extreme conditions, a principle now well established in modern engineering, but foreign to 19th century Appalachian building traditions. The secondary structure connected to the main cabin, it was now apparent, had been designed as a reinforced food storage and emergency shelter area. Berkeley noted, the man had constructed what amounts to a fortress within a fortress, with the connecting passage serving as a windbreak and secondary barrier should the outer walls fail. This redundant design principle, creating backup systems in case primary systems fail, represents another maritime influence in Guthrie's approach. Ships operating in inherently hazardous environments typically incorporated multiple safety measures for critical functions. This redundancy, which had seemed excessive during normal conditions, proved life-saving during the extended crisis of the Great Storm. Perhaps most telling was Guthrie's preparation in terms of supplies. Martha Collins, who was among those sheltered at the cabin during the storm, later recorded, "Never have I witnessed such foresight. While we had considered our own winter stores more than adequate, Mr. Guthrie's provisions were sufficient for 3 times the number of people who sought refuge with him. Cured meats, preserved vegetables, dried fruits, flour, and meal filled an entire room from floor to ceiling. His woodshed, which many had mocked for its excessive size, proved to be precisely what was required for a storm of such unprecedented duration. This level of provisioning represented not just quantitative, but qualitative differences in how Guthrie approached preparation. Where community standards emphasized having enough based on normal expectations, Guthrie had prepared for conditions far beyond the norm. His approach reflected the maritime principle of provisioning not just for expected voyage duration, but for potential delays and emergencies, a mindset shaped by the inherent unpredictability of sea travel. Collins's account continues with a particularly significant observation. Most remarkable to my mind was Mr. Guthrie's demeanor throughout our ordeal. While the rest of us experienced the natural terror of such unprecedented conditions, he maintained a calm efficiency that suggested he had, in some manner, anticipated such a possibility. Not anticipated in the sense of prediction, but prepared in the sense that a wise traveler carries protection against rain even on clear days. This distinction between prediction and preparation represents a core philosophical difference that would later influence how the community incorporated lessons from the Great Storm. Guthrie had not specifically predicted this particular weather event, but had designed his dwelling and preparations with the understanding that extreme conditions, while rare, remained possible. The Cumberland Weekly Gazette, in its first post-storm edition on December 30th, 1874, published a remarkable piece titled "Wisdom in Strange Design: How Guthrie's Folly Saved Lives." The article detailed how the cabin that had been the subject of so much ridicule had become a life-saving shelter for no fewer than 17 people from 5 different families during the worst of the storm. The newspaper's editorial stance represented a complete reversal from its earlier dismissal of Guthrie's methods. The same publication that had questioned his competence now described him as possessing foresight that borders on the prophetic, though based not in mysticism, but in sound principles of construction adapted specifically to mountain conditions. The newspaper account included a rare direct quote from Thomas Guthrie himself. "There is nothing mysterious in building to the conditions, rather than despite them. A ship is not square because the sea does not press upon it squarely. A home in these mountains should be no different." This statement offers the first explicit confirmation of what many had begun to suspect. Guthrie's unconventional design drew directly from his shipbuilding experience, adapting maritime principles of withstanding powerful forces to the context of mountain weather patterns. The analogy between maritime and mountain environments reveals Guthrie's ability to recognize underlying similarities in different contexts, that both ships and mountain dwellings must withstand powerful, multi-directional forces that can persist for extended periods. This conceptual transfer between seemingly unrelated domains represents a form of innovation often overlooked in historical accounts of frontier adaptation. The article continued with specific details about how Guthrie's design had performed during the storm. The asymmetrical roof, which appears awkward to the eye accustomed to standard constructions, prevented snow accumulation that collapsed many conventional roofs. The rounded corners and angled walls deflected wind rather than opposing it directly. Even the unusual placement of the hearth off-center rather than centered on the longest wall as tradition dictates proved purposeful, allowing heat to circulate more effectively throughout the irregular floor plan. These observations highlight how each apparently eccentric feature of the cabin actually served a specific functional purpose, purposes that became evident only when conditions exceeded the normal parameters for which traditional designs were adequate. As the storm finally abated in late December, and the community began the process of assessing damage and rebuilding, attitudes toward Guthrie and his methods underwent a profound shift. The county assessment records from early 1875 show a significant reevaluation of his property value, with Assessor Willard noting, "Dwelling demonstrates exceptional durability and practical design for regional conditions." Value adjusted accordingly. This bureaucratic acknowledgement of Guthrie's vindication was accompanied by a more personal form of recognition. Church attendance records from January 1875 show Guthrie moved from his customary position at the back of the Clearwater Valley Meeting House to a seat among the established families in the front pews, a subtle but significant indication of his altered social standing. More telling than official records, however, are the personal accounts that reveal how completely the experience transformed local perceptions. Isaiah Berkeley, once among the vocal critics of Guthrie's methods, wrote to his brother in February 1875, "I find myself in the peculiar position of dismantling the roof of my own rebuilt cabin to incorporate elements of Guthrie's design. Pride is a luxury less valuable than survival, as we have so harshly learned. This admission captures the humbling effect of the storm on community attitudes. The previously dismissive phrase, Guthrie's folly, disappeared from local discourse, replaced by terms like storm design or Guthrie method that acknowledged the proven effectiveness of his approach. The Harlan County Registry of Deeds shows that in the spring and summer of 1875, Thomas Guthrie was contracted by no fewer than 8 local families to consult on rebuilding their storm-damaged homes. Payment was often made in goods or labor rather than cash, reflecting both the economic realities of frontier life and the new cooperative relationship between Guthrie and his neighbors. One such contract, preserved in the county archives, includes a notable clause designed to incorporate principles demonstrated effective during the Great Storm, with particular attention to roof configuration, corner reinforcement, and provisional storage capacity. This language explicitly acknowledges the validation of Guthrie's methods through their performance during the extreme conditions. More broadly, the architectural influence of Guthrie's design principles began to appear throughout the region. The Cumberland Weekly Gazette, from May 1875, contains an advertisement from the Pineville Lumber Mill offering reinforced roof trusses in the Guthrie method, suggesting how quickly his once ridiculed ideas had been commercialized and incorporated into local building practices. This rapid adoption of innovation following demonstrated effectiveness represents a common pattern in frontier adaptation. While traditional communities often resist unfamiliar methods initially, practical results tend to overcome social resistance when survival advantages become evident. Church records from the Clearwater Valley Meeting House show that Guthrie's previously peripheral position in community life had also changed. The attendance registry notes his appointment to the building committee in March 1875, with specific responsibility for overseeing reinforcements to the meeting house roof. This appointment represents more than just acknowledgement of his technical expertise. It signifies his integration into the governance structures of the community, a shift from outsider to valued contributor. The same unconventional thinking that had previously marked him as suspect now earned him a position of responsibility. The Pineville Sawmill Ledger from April 1875 contains an entry suggesting how completely Guthrie's status had been transformed. A meeting held with T. Guthrie regarding standardization of storm-resistant framing methods for regional distribution. Agreement reached on specification, documentation, and training for mill workers in new techniques. This development indicates a critical transition from individual innovation to systematic dissemination of knowledge. Rather than remaining the exclusive property of its originator, Guthrie's approach was being deliberately integrated into the region's building infrastructure, ensuring its preservation beyond any single practitioner. In a broader historical context, the events surrounding Thomas Guthrie and the Great Cumberland Storm offer a compelling case study in frontier adaptation and the tension between traditional knowledge and innovation. The settled community, with its established building practices passed down through generations, represented a collective wisdom that had generally served well enough in normal conditions. Guthrie, with his outsider perspective and specialized knowledge from a different environment, introduced innovations that were initially rejected but ultimately proved their value when conditions exceeded the norm. This pattern, innovation, resistance, crisis, validation, adoption, appears repeatedly throughout the history of technological and methodological advancement on the American frontier. From agricultural techniques to medical practices to construction methods, communities often required dramatic demonstration of effectiveness before incorporating unfamiliar approaches into their established ways. The meteorological record shows that while the 1874 storm was exceptional, it was not entirely without precedent. Weather Service archives from Louisville contain references to a similar, though less severe, winter storm in 1832 that affected much of the same region. This suggests that such extreme weather events, while rare, were within the realm of possibility that frontier settlers might reasonably prepare for. This historical pattern highlights a key aspect of Guthrie's approach that distinguished it from community standards. He designed for the possible, not merely the probable. Where traditional building methods had evolved to handle conditions that occurred regularly, Guthrie's design anticipated extremes that might occur only once in a generation, a fundamentally different risk calculation that proved its value during the Great Storm. What Guthrie understood and what his neighbors came to appreciate was the difference between preparing for the probable and preparing for the possible, a distinction that often marks the boundary between survival and catastrophe in frontier conditions. As winter turned to spring in 1875, the process of recovery and rebuilding continued throughout Harlan County. The human cost of the storm had been significant, though precise figures remain elusive in the historical record. Church burial records and scattered obituaries suggest approximately 28 deaths attributable to the storm across the county, with causes ranging from exposure to structure collapses to illnesses exacerbated by cold and privation. This death toll, while devastating for a sparsely populated rural area, would likely have been higher without the shelter provided by structures that remained intact throughout the storm, Guthrie's cabin among them. Martha Collins's diary entry from February 1875 makes this point explicitly. It is now generally acknowledged that those who found shelter at the Guthrie property would likely have perished had they remained in their own dwellings, so completely were they destroyed. Against this backdrop of community trauma, Thomas Guthrie's role evolved from outsider to reluctant authority on practical building methods. County records indicate he was formally engaged as a consultant for the rebuilding of the Pineville Schoolhouse in April 1875, with specific mention of incorporating his wind-resistant design principles and reinforcement methods. The schoolhouse project represents a significant public validation of Guthrie's approach. As an institutional building serving the entire community, its reconstruction using his methods signified official endorsement of innovations that had previously been relegated to the margins of acceptable practice. The building specifications for the new schoolhouse, preserved in county records, include several direct adaptations from Guthrie's cabin design: diagonal bracing within walls, an asymmetrical roof pitch that presented less surface area to prevailing winter winds, and reinforced storage areas specifically designated for emergency supplies. These features, once considered eccentric, had become recognized safety measures for public architecture. Perhaps the most significant institutional recognition came in September 1875, when the Harlan County Commission passed what local histories refer to as the Storm Ordinance, a set of building requirements that incorporated many of Guthrie's innovations. The original document, preserved in the county archives, includes provisions for enhanced roof bracing, angled wall supports in exposed locations, and minimum standards for winter provisions that far exceeded previous norms. The ordinance represents a remarkable example of frontier governance adapting to hard-won experience, formalizing lessons that had been paid for in suffering and loss. More remarkable still is the list of contributing advisors mentioned in the document's preamble, where Thomas Guthrie, building specialist, appears alongside the names of long-established community leaders. This official recognition completed Guthrie's transition from ridiculed outsider to respected authority, a transformation driven not by social connections or persuasive arguments, but by the undeniable practical validation of his methods during crisis conditions. The ordinance included specific technical requirements that revealed how thoroughly Guthrie's maritime-inspired approach had been integrated into local building standards. All new dwellings must incorporate diagonal bracing at corners and wall intersections sufficient to withstand lateral pressure equivalent to 60 pounds per square foot. Roof structures must be secured to wall frames using no fewer than 2 metal straps per connection point. Provisional storage sufficient for no less than 40 days at normal consumption must be incorporated into all residential designs. These requirements, far more specific and stringent than previous building practices had demanded, represented a fundamental shift in how the community conceptualized structural resilience. The standard had moved from adequate under normal conditions to survivable in extreme circumstances, a change in philosophy directly attributable to the lessons of the Great Storm and Guthrie's demonstrated alternative. For Guthrie himself, the vindication of his methods brought both opportunity and responsibility. The Harlan County Tax Assessment for 1876 lists his occupation as builder and designer, a significant change from the previous designation of carpenter. Land records show he acquired an additional 30 acres adjacent to his original property in March 1876, suggesting improved financial circumstances. With this expansion came a formalization of his building practice. A business registration filed with the county clerk in June 1876 established Guthrie Design and Construction, one of the earliest specialized building firms in the region. The company ledger, portions of which survived in the Clearwater Valley Archive, shows a steady stream of projects ranging from full home construction to reinforcement modifications of existing structures. What distinguished Guthrie's business model from traditional builders was its emphasis on site-specific adaptation rather than standardized designs. An entry from the company ledger dated August 876 notes, "Survey of Johnson property completed, designed to account for northwestern exposure, seasonal creek patterns, and prevailing wind corridor. Standard reinforcement package to be modified accordingly." This approach represented a significant departure from prevailing construction practices, which typically applied uniform designs with minimal adaptation to specific sites. Guthrie's method required more initial investment in assessment and customized design, but promised greater resilience against site-specific environmental challenges. The social dynamics surrounding Guthrie also continued to evolve. Church records indicate his marriage to Margaret Williams, a widow who had lost her previous home and husband in the storm, in November 1876. The wedding, according to the Clearwater Valley Meeting House Registry, was attended by most families of the northern county, suggesting Guthrie's full integration into the community that had once ostracized him. This marriage connected Guthrie to an established local family, the Williamses having been among the earliest settlers in the northern part of Harlan County. This social integration through marriage often served as a formal marker of community acceptance on the frontier, particularly for outsiders whose different backgrounds or practices had initially marked them as separate. In the years that followed, the practical influence of Guthrie's building methods spread beyond Harlan County. The Cumberland Weekly Gazette from October 1877 mentions a visiting delegation of builders from neighboring Bell and Knox counties seeking instruction in the reinforcement methods that proved so effective during the Great Storm. A subsequent article in March 1878 notes that Guthrie-style roof designs can now be observed as far away as Middlesboro and Corbin. This regional diffusion of innovation represents a significant pattern in frontier adaptation. Successful methods, once proven, tend to spread beyond their point of origin through both formal instruction and informal observation. In an era before standardized building codes or architectural licensing, such diffusion often occurred through direct tradesperson-to-tradesperson transmission. Documentation from the Bell County Historical Society indicates that by 1880, elements of Guthrie's approach had become so thoroughly integrated into local building practices that many practitioners no longer associated them with their original source. A builder's diary from Middlesboro, dated 1881, refers to standard storm bracing when describing techniques that clearly derived from Guthrie's innovations, suggesting how quickly novel approaches can become normalized once their utility is demonstrated. Perhaps the most tangible testament to his lasting impact comes from a Pineville lumber mill catalog from 1880, which advertises standardized kits for storm-resistant mountain dwellings, Guthrie pattern. The accompanying illustration shows a cabin with the distinctive asymmetrical roofline and angled wall supports that characterized Guthrie's original crooked design. What had once been mocked as folly had become a marketable product, its unusual appearance now recognized as purposeful adaptation. The catalog description emphasizes both the functional benefits and the proven performance of the design. Constructed according to principles demonstrated effective during the Great Storm of 74, incorporates reinforced framing, strategic bracing, and enhanced storage capacity. Design modifications available for specific site conditions at additional consulting fee. This commercial packaging of Guthrie's methods represents the final stage in the innovation adoption cycle, from novel idea to accepted practice to standardized product. The reference to site-specific modifications indicates that at least some understanding of his underlying philosophy of adaptation to local conditions had been preserved in the commercialization process. The technical aspects of Guthrie's innovations, pieced together from various historical sources, reveal a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering that was unusual for the time and place. The shipbuilding principles he adapted focused primarily on three areas: lateral force distribution, flexible reinforcement, and redundant support systems. The angled walls that gave his cabin its crooked appearance served to deflect and channel wind forces rather than opposing them directly. This principle, well understood in maritime construction, where vessels must withstand powerful and changeable forces, was novel in Appalachian building traditions that typically employed right-angled structures. The heavy iron bracing he installed at key stress points allowed the structure to flex slightly under pressure without breaking, similar to the way a ship's hull is designed to work with, rather than against the forces of waves. Archaeological examination of surviving structures influenced by Guthrie's methods, conducted by the University of Kentucky in the 1960s, revealed sophisticated joinery techniques at critical stress points. These included scarf joints reinforced with iron straps, a direct adaptation of shipbuilding methods, and an unusual approach to corner construction that created more gradual transitions between perpendicular elements, reducing the concentration of stress that often led to failure in traditional square-cornered structures. Most innovative was his approach to redundancy. The secondary interior structure connected to the main cabin provided a crucial backup system if the outer walls should fail. This concept of layered defenses, while common in military architecture, had rarely been applied to residential construction in the region. The connected storage area, in particular, represented a significant departure from traditional frontier design. Where standard cabins typically incorporated storage areas within the main living space or in detached outbuildings, Guthrie's connected but semi-independent structure created a protected transitional zone that maintained access to essential supplies even during the most extreme conditions. This arrangement eliminated the potentially fatal need to exit the dwelling to retrieve stored provisions during severe weather, a small design change with potentially life-saving implications. Beyond the technical aspects of his building methods, Guthrie's approach to provisioning and resource management proved equally influential in the aftermath of the storm. The Storm Ordinance of 1875 included specific requirements for winter food storage that directly reflected Guthrie's practices, establishing minimum standards of 3 months complete provisions for all household members, to be secured by November of each year. This formalization of preparedness standards represents a significant institutional response to the harsh lessons of the 1874 storm. Prior to this ordinance, winter provisioning had been a matter of individual judgment and family tradition, with considerable variation in practices across the community. The new regulations created a common minimum standard that reduced the vulnerability of the entire settlement to future extreme events. The ordinance further specified categories of essential supplies beyond food that each household was expected to maintain: sufficient lamp oil or candles for illumination during 16 hours of darkness, daily for the prescribed period. Medical supplies including wound dressings, fever powders, and preserved medicinal herbs. Repair materials appropriate to dwelling construction for emergency maintenance during isolation. These detailed requirements reflect a comprehensive approach to self-sufficiency during extended isolation, a condition that the Great Storm had demonstrated was not merely theoretical, but a real possibility for which practical preparation was essential. As Thomas Guthrie's influence on local building practices solidified, the events of 1874-75 began to transition from immediate experience to community lore. The first written account specifically focused on Guthrie, and the storm appears in a self-published pamphlet by Isaiah Berkeley in 1879, titled Weathering the Cumberland, Reflections on the Great Storm and Its Aftermath. Berkeley's account, combining personal experience with collected testimonials, established what would become the standard narrative of Guthrie's vindication. The pamphlet is particularly valuable for its candid reflection on the community's initial rejection of Guthrie's methods. We who had lived generations in these mountains believed our knowledge superior to any newcomer's notions. Our certainty nearly proved our undoing. The lesson was costly but clear. Wisdom may arrive in unexpected forms, and innovation deserves consideration rather than derision. This theme of humility before unfamiliar knowledge would become a central moral element of the Guthrie story as it was passed down through subsequent generations. The tale evolved into what folklorists would recognize as a cautionary narrative about the dangers of dismissing unfamiliar ideas solely because they challenge established practices. Berkeley's pamphlet circulated widely throughout the Cumberland region, with copies preserved in several county historical societies. Its impact extended beyond simply recording events to actively shaping how the community understood and interpreted its experience of the storm and its aftermath. Of particular significance is Berkeley's description of the transformation in community attitudes. Where once we gathered to mock the crooked house on the hillside, we now send our sons to learn its principles. Where once we dismissed the excessive preparations as paranoia, we now incorporate them into our own practices. The storm has taught us that wisdom sometimes appears in forms we fail to recognize until necessity strips away our preconceptions. This passage captures the fundamental reversal in how Guthrie's innovations were perceived, from objects of derision to sources of essential knowledge. It also highlights how crisis can serve as a catalyst for reevaluating established practices and incorporating previously marginalized approaches. By the mid-1880s, a decade after the events, the story of Guthrie's Crooked Cabin had become a standard reference point in local discourse. County Commission meeting minutes from February 1884 contain a telling example, recording a debate about new bridge construction in which a commissioner argued against an unconventional design by stating, "We must be certain this is truly a Guthrie situation and not merely an unnecessary expense." The fact that no explanation of this reference was needed suggests how thoroughly the narrative had been absorbed into local culture. The phrase "a Guthrie situation" is particularly revealing, having evolved to describe circumstances where unconventional approaches might be justified by exceptional conditions. A shorthand reference to the entire complex narrative of innovation, rejection, validation, and adoption that the Great Storm had precipitated. Church sermons from the period occasionally reference the Guthrie story as a moral exemplar. A fragmentary transcript from an 1886 service at the Clearwater Valley Meeting House includes the passage, "Let us remember the lesson of the crooked house, that God's wisdom sometimes comes to us through vessels we are quick to judge as flawed, and that humility before the unfamiliar may spare us from consequences of our own certainty." This religious interpretation of the Guthrie narrative demonstrates how thoroughly it had been integrated into the community's moral framework, providing a reference point for broader ethical principles about judgment, humility, and openness to unfamiliar knowledge. As for Thomas Guthrie himself, the historical record becomes somewhat sparser in his later years. Business registries and tax records indicate his design and construction practice remained active throughout the 1880s, with his son-in-law James Williams becoming a partner in the firm around 1884. Guthrie continued to serve on various county committees related to building standards and emergency preparation until at least 1888, when his name appears for the last time in commission records. The Pineville Hardware Store Ledger from 1887 contains what may be the last first-hand observation of Guthrie in the historical record, noting, T. Guthrie's hands now show the tremor of advancing years, though his mind remains sharp as ever. Spent considerable time instructing young Pearson in the proper method of fitting diagonal braces, emphasizing principles over mere replication of forms. This brief entry captures Guthrie in the role of mentor, passing on not just specific techniques, but the underlying principles that informed them, ensuring that his approach would outlive his direct practice. The emphasis on principles over mere replication suggests his concern that his methods be understood rather than simply copied, preserving the adaptive philosophy that made them effective. The precise date and circumstances of Guthrie's death are not clearly documented in surviving records. A brief obituary in the Cumberland Weekly Gazette from November 1891 mentions the passing of Thomas Guthrie, age 60, whose building methods revolutionized local construction after the Great Storm, suggesting he died that year. Church burial records from the period have gaps due to water damage, but a grave marker in the Clearwater Valley Cemetery bears his name and the dates 1831-1891. The obituary, though brief, indicates the lasting impact he had made on the community. Few individuals have left such a tangible legacy throughout our county and region. In every reinforced roof and braced wall stands a tribute to the man once mocked for his unconventional ideas, now honored for the lives those same ideas have preserved. This posthumous recognition completes the narrative arc of Guthrie's relationship with the community, from outsider to respected innovator whose contributions had become integral to local life. The transformation of his public identity parallels the transformation of his building methods from ridiculed oddities to established standards. What is more clearly traced is the legacy of his innovations. A survey of building styles conducted by a WPA historical project in 1937, preserved in the Kentucky State Archives, identified distinctive storm-resistant adaptations in residential architecture throughout southeastern Kentucky and neighboring portions of Virginia and Tennessee. These included asymmetrical roof designs, specialized bracing systems, and reinforced storage facilities that could be directly traced to Guthrie's original concepts. The survey specifically noted that locals still refer to certain architectural features as Guthrie angles or Guthrie braces, though many younger residents are unaware of the specific historical origin of these terms. This linguistic residue suggests how thoroughly his methods had been integrated into regional building traditions, persisting even as the specific narrative of their origin began to fade from common knowledge. A particularly telling observation in the WPA report concerns how completely certain elements of Guthrie's approach had been normalized. What once appeared as distinctive, crooked structures have, over successive generations of building, been gradually refined into more conventional-appearing forms, while retaining the essential structural principles that provide enhanced resistance to extreme conditions. This evolution demonstrates a common pattern in the adoption of innovations, where initially dramatic departures from convention are gradually modified to become more aesthetically compatible with established forms, even as their functional benefits are preserved. The crooked cabin had spawned descendants that retained its strength while losing some of its visual distinctiveness. The survey identified specific surviving structures directly influenced by Guthrie, including the Pineville Meeting House, rebuilt 1877, the Bell County Courthouse, 1882, and approximately 35 private dwellings throughout the region. Most significant was the identification of second and third generation structures that incorporated Guthrie-derived features without direct connection to him or his firm, evidence of how thoroughly his methods had been integrated into general building practice. The story might have remained a purely local historical footnote if not for the academic interest of Dr. Howard Lanchester, an architectural historian from the University of Kentucky who conducted field research in Appalachian building techniques during the late 1950s. Lanchester's discovery of the Guthrie narrative in county archives led to his 1963 journal article, Adaptive Architecture, Maritime Influences in Appalachian Storm-Resistant Building Design, which brought scholarly attention to the case. Lanchester's research was particularly valuable in establishing the technical legitimacy of Guthrie's innovations. Through structural analysis of surviving examples of Guthrie-influenced buildings, Lanchester demonstrated that the unconventional designs did indeed provide superior resistance to high winds and snow loading compared to traditional rectangular structures of the same era. Modern engineering analysis confirms that many of Guthrie's intuitive adaptations anticipated principles that would later be formalized in structural engineering codes. His use of diagonal bracing, for instance, effectively created what engineers now recognize as shear walls, structural elements specifically designed to resist lateral forces. His asymmetrical roof design reduced the surface area exposed to prevailing winds while maintaining adequate precipitation shedding, a balance of competing functional requirements that demonstrated sophisticated design thinking. The article included a particularly notable passage. What appears most remarkable in the Guthrie case is not merely the effectiveness of his technical adaptations, but how completely these innovations were rejected until dramatic circumstances forced their reconsideration. This suggests that the barriers to architectural evolution in traditional communities may be more social than practical, with potentially significant implications for modern building code development and implementation. This observation points to a broader historical significance of the Guthrie narrative beyond its local context. The pattern of innovation, rejection, crisis, and eventual adoption represents a microcosm of how traditional communities often respond to outside knowledge, a process that continues to shape responses to new building techniques and disaster preparedness strategies in rural regions worldwide. Lanchester's article stimulated renewed local interest in the Guthrie story. The Harlan County Historical Society, in response to academic attention, established a small permanent exhibit in 1965 dedicated to Guthrie and the Great Storm. The exhibit featured archaeological artifacts from the original cabin site, reproductions of key documents, and explanatory materials placing the events in broader historical context. A plaque installed at the exhibit summarized the moral dimension that had become central to local understanding of the narrative. Thomas Guthrie's story reminds us that true preparation involves looking beyond normal expectations to what might be possible, and that unfamiliar ideas deserve consideration rather than immediate dismissal. The lessons of the Great Storm continue to influence how we build, how we prepare, and how we evaluate new approaches to old challenges. This interpretation emphasizes the broader philosophical implications of the Guthrie story beyond its specific technical innovations. It presents the narrative as a case study in the value of intellectual flexibility and the potential costs of rejecting unfamiliar ideas without fair evaluation, themes with relevance far beyond building techniques or storm preparation. By the centennial of the Great Cumberland Storm in 1974, the story of Thomas Guthrie and his crooked cabin had been largely relegated to academic circles and local historical societies. A modest exhibition at the Harlan County Historical Society marked the anniversary, displaying the few surviving artifacts directly connected to Guthrie, including his original property deed, selected pages from his business ledger, and a hand-drawn sketch of roof bracing techniques believed to be in his hand. The exhibition catalog noted a certain irony. While Guthrie's technical innovations have been thoroughly integrated into local building practices, to the point where many modern residents would be surprised to learn their origins, the narrative of initial rejection and eventual validation has been largely forgotten outside academic circles. Perhaps there is a lesson in this pattern as well. Innovations may persist, while the stories of their difficult births fade from memory. This observation highlights a critical aspect of the Guthrie legacy. His technical contributions survived in the physical structures and building practices of the region, while the equally valuable social lesson about openness to unfamiliar knowledge and the dangers of ridicule before understanding became obscured over time. Yet the moral dimensions of the narrative retained significance for those who studied it. In his keynote address at the Centennial Exhibition, Professor Emory Jenkins of East Tennessee State University observed, "The Guthrie story reminds us that preparation is not merely a matter of physical resources, but of intellectual flexibility. The capacity to recognize valuable insight, regardless of its source or how strangely it may initially appear, can make the difference between resilience and catastrophe when conditions exceed our familiar parameters." This theme of intellectual humility in the face of unfamiliar knowledge resonates beyond the specific historical context of 1870s Kentucky. It speaks to a broader pattern in human communities facing uncertain conditions where adherence to established methods can sometimes persist even when evidence suggests their inadequacy. The Centennial also sparked renewed academic interest in the Guthrie case. A 1976 structural engineering study by Dr. The study concluded that, under simulated extreme wind conditions, the Guthrie design demonstrates 42% greater resistance to structural failure, with particularly significant advantages in asymmetrical loading scenarios similar to those described in historical accounts of the 1874 storm. This modern analytical validation of Guthrie's intuitive engineering confirms that his innovations represented genuinely superior adaptations to extreme conditions rather than merely fortunate coincidences. Marion Hayes of Carnegie Mellon University used computer modeling to analyze the wind resistance properties of reconstructed Guthrie-style framing compared to traditional Appalachian building methods. The study noted that many of his methods anticipated structural engineering principles that would not be formally codified until well into the 20th century, suggesting that his practical experience in shipbuilding had led him to insights that theoretical structural engineering would only later formalize. The historical record surrounding Thomas Guthrie and the Great Cumberland Storm offers no simple heroes or villains, only human beings navigating the tension between tradition and innovation, between communal wisdom and individual insight. The established settlers who initially mocked Guthrie's methods were not acting from malice but from confidence in techniques that had generally served their community well. Guthrie himself, by all accounts, never sought to impose his ideas, but simply built according to his understanding, allowing results to speak for themselves. This nuanced understanding of the human dynamics involved distinguishes the Guthrie narrative from simplistic morality tales of visionaries persecuted by the ignorant. Both the community's initial skepticism and Guthrie's quiet persistence reflected reasonable responses to their respective experiences and knowledge bases. What transformed this unremarkable human dynamic into an instructive historical narrative was the intervention of extreme circumstances that tested both approaches beyond their normal parameters. The storm of 1874 created conditions where the limitations of traditional methods and the advantages of Guthrie's innovations became starkly apparent, catalyzing a community-wide reevaluation that might otherwise never have occurred. In this sense, the storm served as a natural experiment that revealed strengths and weaknesses that normal conditions had concealed. In this sense, the enduring value of the Guthrie narrative lies not in establishing which approach was absolutely right or wrong, but in illustrating how communities navigate the complex process of incorporating new knowledge, especially when that knowledge challenges established practices. The story of Thomas Guthrie's Crooked Cabin stands as a reminder that innovation often appears strange or unnecessary until conditions change enough to reveal its value. It suggests that true preparation involves not just physical resources, but intellectual flexibility, the capacity to consider unfamiliar approaches that may be better adapted to circumstances beyond our normal experience. As climate patterns continue to shift and communities worldwide face increasingly unpredictable conditions, this frontier lesson retains its relevance. The balance between respecting established wisdom and remaining open to unconventional solutions remains as challenging and as vital as it was when Thomas Guthrie first laid the irregular foundation of his storm-resistant home on that Kentucky hillside in 1873. The final word on Guthrie's legacy perhaps belongs to his granddaughter, Mary Williams Patterson, who was interviewed by a WPA oral historian in 1938. Her recollection, preserved in the Kentucky Folklife archives, distills the essence of the narrative that has been reconstructed here from scattered historical fragments. Grandfather never spoke against those who mocked his methods. He simply built as he knew best and kept to himself until the storm came. Afterward, he shared everything he knew without bitterness or pride. He would say only that nature teaches the patient observer, and that a wise builder prepares not just for the weather he has seen, but for the weather that might come. That lesson saved lives then, and I believe it saves lives still, though many who follow his methods now have forgotten the man who brought them here. In this simple familial recollection lies the core of what might be called the Guthrie principle, preparation based not merely on past experience, but on reasoned anticipation of possible extremes. This principle, embodied in the unusual angles and reinforcements of a once ridiculed cabin, quietly continues to influence structures throughout the Appalachian region, a legacy more enduring than the man himself might ever have imagined when he first faced the skepticism of his neighbors. The crooked cabin that withstood the strongest storm in years stands as a testament to the value of foresight, the cost of ridicule before understanding, and the capacity of communities to learn and adapt when circumstances reveal the limitations of established practices. It is a quintessentially American frontier tale, where innovation emerges not from abstract theory but from practical necessity, and where wisdom is measured not by its source, but by its effectiveness when conditions exceed the expected. As we face our own uncertain futures and unpredictable challenges, the lesson of Thomas Guthrie's Crooked Cabin offers a valuable perspective. Sometimes the most important preparations may be those that seem unnecessary until they become indispensable.